Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I'll be moderating today's webinar in our continuing series breaking down the CFPB's debt collection rule. Today's webinar is entitled, Where Should You Go From Here? In the time since the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has released its debt collection rule, there's been a lot of information and details shared within the accounts receivable management industry. But from an operational perspective, what does it all mean? In this webinar, which is part of a series being sponsored by TCN, we have a panel of leading industry executives here who are going to share their insights and perspectives to help the industry understand how the rule is going to change, how business is done, and what you need to start doing to prepare now. Rather than my usual spiel about accountsrecovery.net, I'm going to take a minute and talk about Collector Live, which is coming on January 12th. Collector Live is the industry's only event aimed at educating and motivating frontline collection agents. The event features about 20 great speakers from across the industry, giving 15-minute presentations about different aspects of the collections industry. It only costs $197 to register and have your entire office participate in this great event. Please go to www.collector.live to check it out and to register. Now, let me tell you a little bit about today's speakers. Dennis Barton is the owner of the Barton Law Group, a collection law firm filing collection lawsuits in Missouri and Illinois. Dennis is an ACA board member and the 2020 Certified Instructor of the Year. John Bedard is a nationally recognized authority on the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. He serves as counsel to several professional trade organizations, including the Georgia Collectors Association. John is a former board member of the board of directors of the industry's leading professional trade organization, ACA International. He serves as the state of Georgia compliance chairperson for ACA International and is a former chairperson and program designation award recipient of ACA International's Members Attorney Program. Since graduating law school in 1986, Robbie Malone has focused her practice on litigation and trial. Her knowledge in that area of law has continued through her work representing collection agencies in the FDCPA arena. She has been a long-serving member of the Judicial Fund Committee. She was ACA's Attorney of the Year in 2019 and is a founding partner with Malone, Frost, Martin, headquartered in Dallas, Texas. Judd Peak is the Chief Compliance Officer at Capital Accounts. He brings more than 2 decades of experience and is recognized as a leader for ARM and revenue cycle compliance with particular emphasis on the healthcare industry. Judd has built compliance programs at 2 different ARM companies and has honed particular expertise in healthcare, privacy, patient payments, and industry best practices. The format for today's webinar will be a panel discussion. We encourage everybody to submit questions and we'll get to them as our discussion is ongoing. To submit a question, please enter it into the Q&A tab or the chat module on your Zoom webinar control panel. This event is being recorded and a recording will be made available in the coming days on accountsrecovery.net. Finally, since we're going to be talking about compliance today, let me read the following disclaimer. This presentation is not intended to be legal advice and may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area and should never be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. With that, let me bring on the panel and let's start our conversation. You know, one of the questions that I've been asked most often since the CFPB released the part 1 of the debt collection rule back in October was, can we start implementing these provisions now, or do we have to wait for the rule to go into effect next November? So my question is, what can and should agencies be doing now to start preparing to comply? Should agencies wait until after President-elect Biden takes office to see if there's going to be a new CFPB director and whether the rule will change? And Dennis, since you come first alphabetically and you were the first to log on, I'm going to give you the honor of going first today.
All right, thank you. Well, I appreciate, first of all, being part of such a great panel of speakers. And this is a question I've already gotten from a lot of my clients, and as a collection attorney myself, puts me as a debt collector under the FDCPA. It's a question I need to answer. I think generally speaking, because the law isn't in effect yet, to get in front of the law can be okay in some respects, but real bad in others. To me, the general rule is if the new law is more restrictive than the current law, then you can do it. Like if you're adding extra things, make your life more restrictive, sooner rather than later, okay. But if the new law is less restrictive, meaning it doesn't require you to do some things that the new law or the way courts interpret the current law that if you're currently having to do those things and the new law says don't, then I would say do not do that. For example, with call frequency, if you're calling less than what the new rules allow you to call, then okay, you can change your policies to call, as much as the new rules allow. But if you are going to do something like change your limited content message, which I'm sure the whole group will talk about as we go on, when you don't say you're a debt collector, that's a bad idea, because the law is not where that's at yet. Just like any other law, you can't do something until it becomes the law becomes effective. So that's kind of my general rule of thumb. And if you want to restrict yourself more than you have to comply with the rule that's going to be coming, great. But don't make it too easy, but don't start limiting things that when those limitations are not yet in place. What do you guys think?
Well, I'll chime in here. So I think Dennis's advice is really good. If the platform.
I'm sorry, could you say that again, please? Sorry, go ahead.
Dennis is right. Yeah, Dennis is right. I will sign that and send it to you. I think Dennis is right, is that you don't want to do anything that would be potentially less than what is currently required under the law. So what we'll tell you from a litigation standpoint is that the new law isn't really going to govern what happens in the courtroom until after the law goes in effect in November of 21. And the thing is that even then, we're not going to see those lawsuits and how the judges actually interpret what the statute means until sometime in probably close to 2023. So guys, it's 2 years before you really see any guidance from the court about how to interpret a statute. So I would use caution in deciding what I wanted to do. The one thing that my compliance guys, Frost and Lorraine Lyons and those guys are suggesting, I think is a good suggestion, is that if you are wanting to eventually move to the LCM, the limited content message, now would be a good time for you to make sure that you can do a DBA if your name of your industry has the word collections in the title. And by that, we mean go and get you a DBA in your state and comply with that, so that whenever you're ready to move to the LCM, you're already in place to do that. I would not start doing the LCM until we see what's going to happen. I don't think anybody on this panel thinks that the new CFPB director is going to be industry favorable. If it's Biden's selection, they're going to be more consumer oriented, and we're going to see some of the things that we thought were good things in this rule potentially to be pulled back. The only way the rule would sort of help you now is that it might support an allegation for bona fide error, but since it's not actually law, it doesn't even do that. So I think I would proceed with caution. I would consider going and getting the DBA to help you with the use of the LCM. But other than that, I would tread very carefully about doing anything before we see what happens with the new administration.
I like how this approach, so for Robbie and for Dennis and for John, taking the perspective of outside legal counsel, you don't want to jump the gun on one thing in the rule before it's become effective, and that might counter some, one of the circuit interpretations of the current FDCPA. I think that's great, and that's totally different, approach than I was taking from inside an agency. I was dividing the final rule into two buckets in my head. One would be those things that are easy to implement operationally, expense-wise, and those things that will take time. There are programming, there are fundamental system changes that need to be taken in place before you're able to comply with the new parts of the final rule. Very much more of a budgetary or resource allocation approach than I think the legal risk. And I think, for any agency that's looking at the new rule, or not the new rule, the final rule, and deciding, what we're going to pick off first, and putting together your timeline as far as implementation, what do we want to wait on versus what do we want to go ahead and start the implementation process. I think both of those are going to be necessary. Some things are going to be a lot, there's going to be a lot of expense involved. There's going to be a lot of capital expenditure and time to actually build out. A couple of examples that came to my mind would be like the call recording retentions. That's an expense. Being able to build a tracking system for call caps and being able to test against that, and more than just having a written policy on call caps. That's going to be something that requires programming into your dialing system or your CRM or what have you as well. So I think it's a balance between trying to not pull in those expenses too soon and still have enough time to be able to build those effectively, so that when the green light goes and these become effective, you're ready to comply from hopefully day one.
Yeah, Robbie mentioned something that's very important, which is the DBA. And I don't underestimate, and I don't want listeners to underestimate the effort involved in effectively changing your company's public name, because you're just not going to use the DBA on the voicemail message that you're going to be leaving. You're going to be changing your letters now. You're going to be changing all kinds of things at your company as a result of implementing a DBA. And so don't take lightly the suggestion that if you want to leave a voicemail, all you got to do is get a DBA. That's true, but there's a lot more involved in implementing a DBA company-wide, so that your public-facing identity is consistent with your DBA, and you're not sending letters in one name and voicemails in another, and potentially emails in another name. It's very significant to be changing your company's name, whether you're changing the corporate name itself or you're changing it to a DBA to use. And so, although the Bureau gives us a potential solution if we want to leave limited voicemail messages, the significance of getting a DBA and changing your company's name is not light. With respect to answering Mike's original question, do we implement these things now? Do we wait? You got to understand, many of the provisions of these new rules, I'll call it part 1 and part 2, create bona fide errors, create protections. I'm trying to avoid the word safe harbor, but create defenses for debt collectors to use when they're communicating electronically. Those defenses will not be the law until the rule becomes implemented a year from now. And so courts will not be required to give defendants a bona fide error defense prior to the implementation of these rules, or the effective date of these rules next year. And that's important. The other thing, Dennis, that I've been telling clients who ask this question is, I tell them, look, change at your company should not be knee-jerk. Change should be the result of deliberate, thoughtful process, so that you are creating policies, you are creating procedures, you are creating controls, preventive and detective controls, and you are creating audit processes for every new communication channel you roll out at your company. That takes some time. You're not going to do that in a week or 2 weeks, right? And so, when clients call now and say, oh, we want to use the limited content message now. Okay, the rule isn't going to give you protection for that yet. Will you have arguments about why that doesn't violate the law? Yes. But until that rule becomes effective, you're not going to get the protections of the rule per se. And so, I'm encouraging clients to be very thoughtful and deliberate about changes they make at the company now. I don't tell clients, no, I don't think you should not make any change, but planning is what should be happening now. You should be consuming this now, 900 pages of new rules that we have. You need to be consuming it. You need to be understanding it very thoroughly. Then you need to be thinking and planning about how you're going to be implementing things as the enforcement date comes closer and closer.
John, I think you make a great point too about the DBA and not waiting on that, because keep in mind, everybody, there's a lot of people are going to be needing a DBA, and so not only do you want to make sure you get yours in time, but you get the one you want, really, because you may find that there's a lot of other agencies that are getting the one that maybe you would have liked to have gotten. And as John said, you're going to have to, it's going to be part of your new identity. And you're going to have to get your people used to it, saying the new name and not the old name. And which also ties into the preparation. Just to echo John, which is always a good idea. Man, this is one of these, this is a slow go. The tortoise and the hare reminds me of the old story about tortoise and the hare. Don't rush off, get your new policies and procedures, get ready to go without fully and thoroughly understanding. Really take it's a slow burn. Read these rules, make sure you understand them, talk to counsel, so you can do a one-time policy and procedure change instead of having to do different ones over and over and retraining if you got it wrong the first time. So just really take your time.
want to add something else about the DBA, because I think John's point about this being a substantial change across the business is actually even bigger than what, and I'm sorry, I just kind of loosely threw it out there, but the truth is now, if you decide to do a DBA, then you've got to go and find out whether or not you've complied with the requirements of of the states that you're practicing in, because there are going to be states that have specific requirements where you have a DBA. If you want to maintain your license, your bond, or whatever it may be required for that specific state, you've got to put them on notice. Some of them have requirements that you give them X amount of time before you can actually make the transition. And that's going to be a state by state determination. This is not an easy change. I think it's a smart change to make, but and this is something you guys ought to really seriously be thinking about doing, starting after the first of the year. If this is the route you want to go, I would be thinking you better be keying this up at least before at early part of the second quarter, so that you have time to get it in line. And just remember, if there are probably a whole lot of things you've never thought of, like whether or not your bond in a particular state is going to cover a DBA, whether or not your insurance policy is going to cover the DBA. There's a whole bunch of practical sides of that would benefit your decision to do it. And again, keep in mind, even after we tell you that this is a good idea to do, we're still not going to know from a judge until another 2 years whether or not this is as good of a defense as we really could want. So just, I think flexibility is smart, but I also think this is one of those where you got to have a really long checklist and make sure you're paying attention to all the nuances.
You know, actually, Mike, you asked about Biden and, whether these will change when, Biden, appoints someone new to take over this. And yeah, I mean, I guess things could change, but we have what we have now. And from a preparation standpoint, I mean, I'd like to hear what you guys think, but I would say prepare with the information we have now and the rules that we have now, with the anticipation that while changes may occur, they probably won't be dramatic. What do you guys think?
I think that if it is a close call, if you look at the rule and you think, well, this is helpful to the consumer, then you bet that one will probably make it through. If you look at it, you think this is helpful to the agency, I would think I might slow play that one, because I think that what's going to happen under the new administration is things that are helpful to the consumer are going to be green lighted and pushed all the way through. Things that are helpful to the agency are the ones they're going to take a harder look at. That's what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, I would parrot that, Robbie, to try to, as far as prioritizing what's at risk or not. I don't have a good feel for like the likelihood of change under a Biden administration versus what we have now. I'll leave that to the regulatory attorneys to try to and lobbyists to see what that would be. But I do fear for it, and one of the things I definitely don't want to go back to leadership, ownership, and the board of directors of my company this time next year is say, we invested all this time and expense to create XYZ change, and we don't have to do that now. And trying to answer that one, that's a conversation I don't want to have. So to the extent we can foreshadow or foresee implementation or effective date next fall, and being able to meet that with whatever compliance change we need. I really don't see the benefit in being proactive and getting that implemented early rather than late, just because of that outlying factor. I don't know what we're going to be looking at in November of 2021 versus November of 2020.
I don't think anybody does, Judd. I mean, there's going to be a new director, right? And so whether or not that new director is going to, pull back on these rules or not, nobody knows the answer to that. Which is your point is well taken here about investing all this money, if that's a risk. Hopefully by Q1 next year, Q2 next year, we'll have a really good idea on whether or not that's going to happen. But nobody really knows. And I would proceed with caution if you're planning on making a whole lot of changes in the next 30 days. And so, because, you never know what's really going to happen here. Another thing, there aren't a lot of very significant things that these new rules mandate, right? It mandates record retention. It mandates opt-outs in electronic communications. It's going to mandate a legal presumption when it comes to call volume and to a lesser degree contact volume. A lot of what these rules do, however, is create bona fide error defenses. And so to the extent we're concerned about investing a lot of money in order to comply with mandates, well, we could maybe hold back a little bit and invest money in some of the things that you talked about earlier, Judd, which was what's required? What am I going to have to do? All right. So I need to be thinking about the things that are mandated to make sure that if nothing changes about these rules, I'm going to be prepared to satisfy the mandates. If I want the sort of the icing on the cake and getting the benefit of the bona fide error and all those other kind of things, well, then that's maybe a secondary consideration when it comes to making investments.
And Judd, you talked about in your earlier comments about storage, and that's one that, I was talking to Aaron Wright over at Interpros, and he was talking about the importance of making sure that not only can you store your information, but that you have a system that's able to organize it as well. For example, with me, I call record, of course, and I have all my calls and keep them for however, indefinitely, I guess right now. But it's not integrated with my collection system. So there are two different databases. And while it's good that I have them, I'll need to tie these in better if I need to keep everything for 3 years. And so it's just a reminder of something that you need to not only have the storage, but have it organized as well. And that's something we can all do now.
Yeah. So the difference between checking the box that you complied with a rule and being able to demonstrate and prove that you have, and being able to have that accessible.
That brings us back to the
go ahead,
bona
Robbie.
fide.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, that brings us back to the bona fide error, and this is the thing that as litigation attorneys that we know on our side, which is that even if the rules build in something that is a bona fide error, and even if you've done things that can check it off the box, the problem with bona fide error defenses is that the courts can still say there's a fact issue as to whether or not you've done it. And very often those have to be tried. So the only way you're going to wind up winning that bona fide error early enough to avoid the cost of a major litigation is it's going to have to be so rock solid that there's no argument about it. And then you've got to be prepared to defend that further down the line. I don't know how that's going to play out. That's what I was talking about. It's going to be a couple years before we can tell you that a court's going to say, well, if they follow the CFPB rule, period, then we're going to let that pass and we're not going to make them try the case to prove that they comply with it. We can't tell you that. All we can tell you is that they're actually giving us some rules that might be helpful in proving up a bona fide error defense.
Just going to jump in quickly here. I wanted to hit the pause button on our discussion and just say a few words about the sponsor of today's webinar. TCN provides cost-effective call center solutions for traditional contact centers, collection agencies, and thousands of businesses worldwide. TCN has continually stayed current with TCPA and CFPB changes by introducing enhancements to its core platform, one of which is TCN's natural language compliance, which uses smart algorithms to build compliance rules naturally. Simply type your rule into the TCN Compliance Manager, and the natural language compliance engine will build an easy to understand compliance rule. One example of a rule would be deny outbound calls before 8 a.m. and after 9 p.m. You could even type a rule that would limit 7 calls in 7 days. There's no limit to the number of rules TCN's processing engine can compute. TCN software is a platform suite that also provides in-data management services that eliminate data entry errors, business intelligence with reporting dashboards, call reporting with storage, smart IVR with payment capabilities, speech analysis and transcription, and much more. Regardless of size, location, or application, TCN can provide robust solutions for your call center and collection agency. Please give TCN a call or visit them at www.tcn for more information. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar and all of the webinars in this series on the CFPB's debt collection rule. I wanted to circle back to something we've been discussing, that the panel has been discussing, and use it as an opportunity to sort of fold in a question that's come in from the audience, and as a reminder, an opportunity to remind everybody, if you have a question for our panel, send it to us through the chat module or the Q&A tab, and we'll get it asked and answered during our remaining time today. And the question was, do you think the limited content message is safe to start using now or not? And I'm going to guess that, based on the discussion that we've had so far, obviously we've got 4 lawyers, so it's going to be 4 people saying it depends. But beyond that, it's going to be sort of more of a business decision at this point in terms of how much, of a risk tolerance each agency has. Am I sort of summarizing that adequately, or is there anything else that anyone would want to add to that conversation, to that question?
I thought we just said no, got a flat out.
Okay.
You guys, I mean, it was kind of an interesting, rare moment for attorneys to have unified.
And I missed it. How did I miss it?
So, hold on a second. I might have
No,
a
don't
different
ruin
approach
this
to
for us, John. Don't ruin this moment for us. Come on now.
Okay, I won't make it nebulous, I promise. I think that this limited content message is a defendable message today. However, it is not defendable because the rule gives you protection. It's defendable because a judge who interprets the FDCPA correctly will find that it is not a communication, and therefore it should be a defendable message today before a court that is willing to read the statute correctly. But it is not defendable because the rule gives you protection. The rule will not give you protection until the rule becomes enforceable, which is next year. That does not mean I'm, suggesting that clients immediately switch over to this limited content message. When it comes to messages, in my view, agencies, collectors really should look at their data, their phone call data, their message data, their RPC rates. There is some very, very important information that an agency ought to consider before deciding whether to leave messages at all. And that information is unique to every agency, and that information is already in the possession of every collector. And they ought to really study that data before deciding whether they're going to leave messages or not, because they might learn that for the 16 and a half hours a week that their highly skilled agents are talking to computers, they may have been able to make another 22% of calls and get RPCs on them and convert them over to dollars. And so there's a lot of analysis, I think, goes into the decision-making process of whether to leave messages, notwithstanding if it's the limited content message or not. The other thing that we've been telling clients that are considering a limited content message is to absolutely do some benchmarking. You cannot use the same phone numbers that you leave on a limited content message that you use everywhere else, because you need to be able to measure the effectiveness of a limited content message. And the only way to do that is to start segmenting phone numbers. And that's the way we've been talking to clients about this limited content message. It will not be an inexpensive defense to be trying to defend a limited content message without the benefit of the rules protection, which you don't get now until November of 2021.
And to that point, and I guess, while I will differ a little bit with John as to the how defensible it is, I'm a little more pessimistic on how defensible it is right now. More importantly, you're likely to get sued, even if you end up defending it well, and better outcome, or better circumstances to not get sued at all rather than to successfully defend. So that's the biggest reason I say no, is because you're begging for a lawsuit if you do it prior to the rule change.
Well, remember, the bona fide error defense, you have to have policies and procedures designed to avoid error, right? And so, it's not clear to me why the limited content message would violate the law today, but not violate the law after the rule comes in, if the basis of the protection in the rule is that it's not a communication at all. But nonetheless, having to defend that without the rules protection might not be an appetizing thing.
I think I might consider the jurisdiction if I were going to make a decision about doing it, because right now some really interesting things are happening in Florida. And also in the Seventh Circuit is starting to echo some of the standing challenges. And I think these limited content messages might benefit from a challenge on a standing issue. So if I had some extra money and I wanted to hire a great lawyer like John Bedard to go do it for me in the 11th Circuit, I might be willing to take a risk of running it there. But I got to be honest, guys, the conservative approach on this is the best one. Which, I mean, when in doubt, don't leave messages. Just when in doubt, don't leave messages. And then the next approach is don't do this until the rule requires you to do it. That's the conservative approach.
So looking at all the different sections and provisions in both Part 1 and Part 2 of the debt collection rule, would you advise, if you're an outside attorney like Dennis, John, or Robbie, or Judd, are you looking at the rule and just going sort of section by section when looking at how you sort of how you have to adapt your policies and procedures? Or are you going to look at the rule and sort of prioritize making certain changes over others?
I'll tell you how I'm approaching it. Going section by section and making that your task list, I don't think that's the preferred approach. I'm approaching this as kind of creating two buckets. One, what is required under the final rule, and two, what is recommended. And that gives you your levels of priority on different projects. And as far as functionally how I'm trying to organize and implement that, and this works for me, so it may be working for other agencies as well. I've got a Kanban style board on Trello. I think it's a free website, and it's just a way to organize, prioritize, and project manage all these different things that are coming up. If we're talking about the LCM, it's more than just scripting the limited content message. When and if you're ready to implement that, you've got to be able to. John Bedard noted the importance of being able to track that and the effectiveness of it, and whether you need to change your CRM to be able to distinguish that from other communications. There are a lot of different parts of it that involved operations, collection, your programming side of it, IT and IS, your compliance department. All those need to be part of that project tool. So this Kanban board that I'm using to run this and making sure nothing slips through the cracks is the best way I've found to do that. So it's not for everybody necessarily, but that's what I recommend.
I like that approach, Judd. What do these rules require? What am I obligated to do? Those seem to be sort of at the highest priority list to say, okay, if these things become effective a year from now, what is it that I'm going to be mandated to do? And then, what are the things that are permissive? What am I allowed to take advantage of? How, if I want to take advantage of a bona fide error defense, how do I do that? And then maybe, secondary priority, but absolutely, if you're somebody like Judd, who is managing the compliance for an entire agency, is distinguishing the mandates from the permissives, I think is a really good approach right there, because you don't want to be caught not complying with something once these rules become effective.
And some of it may be easy to do. I mean, your agency might be already complying with something that's new in the rule. If it's a matter of how long you keep your call recordings, some agencies are already they're not purging them; they keep them forever anyway. So that's an easy checkbox. But you need to have that tracked in some way so that you're not missing anything.
And then triaging in between, okay, here are all the things that are required. Now, how do we triage these items too? Because some, like you said, might be a lot easier to comply with than others.
And you need to backdate from the effective date too. I mean, if something's going to take a 6-month period to get your institutional creditor clients on board, to get programming in place, to find out whatever that solution is to be able to comply, estimate the amount of time that's going to take and backdate from the effective date, because you want to make sure that you're not at the 11th hour with a lot of work to do.
I like something Judd said earlier when he was talking about this when we first started, was that one of the things he factored in was like stuff that was going to be not that expensive to do versus the stuff that's going to cost him more. I think I would tell my clients that I would want to play that as a factor, because if there's something that's in the rule that you think is going to cost you a ton of money, and you talk to your attorney about it and they say, yeah, I'm not sure that is one that's going to actually make the transition, then why would you spend all that money if it's something we can avoid? So I do like putting an idea about how much it's going to cost to make the transition. And that's going to be specifically just the agency is going to know what that is, because every technology and every process is different with every agency. So you guys are going to know what are the most expensive. What I would also tell you, I know this is going to, I'm a defense attorney. So if you get sued, I'm your girl, but I'm not normally the person you're going to call about a compliance thing. So what I'm going to tell you is that I would take the time to actually schedule some talks with my compliance attorneys. If you don't have one in-house, now's the time to start talking to someone and talk to them about their process. And maybe you can spread that cost over a little bit so it's not hitting you all at one time. Because if you're a smaller agency, I recognize that that's a big cost. But if you're not talking to some people about what does this mean for you and the size of agency you are and where you are, you're going to find out you're going to wind up in my arena, which is when you've been sued, and you're going to have to spend a lot more money to fix it. So I think some proactive, if you don't have an in-house attorney of your own, or even if you do have an in-house attorney, now's the time to actually talk to some compliance specialists and sort of figure out what you're doing. That would be my advice to you.
From a collection attorney standpoint, the way I'm doing it is a lot like what Judd said. I'm taking certain things that I know I need to have done, and I'm going to prioritize. For example, I'm starting with the validation notice changes. I'm going to have a meeting next week, in fact, with my team, and talk about what we need to do, with our system, and talk to our collection system provider to see how we need to coordinate to make changes. But given how big how many cases are filed over validation notices, I want to make sure that that one is down. And depending on, and I need to look at it one more time, but that's probably something we could even put into place sooner rather than later, even before the effective date, to make sure things are in place. But that's just something I'm gonna have to look at again. But that's where I'm gonna put my priority. And then after that, I'll probably turn to policies and procedures relating to how to talk to people electronically through emails and texts. But I'm starting with the validation notice.
Dennis said something there that I mentioned earlier about the Trinchell line of cases that are developing, and the other thing, what I think might be really interesting that's coming out of the courts that's directly going to impact this stuff is the direction the courts are taking is going to kill potential class actions on letter cases. So if you're thinking about making a change to your letter, now's actually a really good time to do it in general, because I think that the cases we're getting, the Supreme Court has accepted a case about whether or not every member of the class has to show actual damage. And that's up right now. So this is a really hot area to consider for that as a sort of a side note.
I was talking with Bobby Blue over at Renkem, and about his letters and what they're doing, and they're not providing templates for anybody. You got to do your own template and give it to them. But they have said that they see something that's kind of funky, they'll make sure they talk to you about it. So while it's best to have an attorney to put your letter together with you, your letter provider can also help you in that process.
And we cannot overemphasize the need to make sure that if you are changing your letters, that you go through your company's change control process, right? We're not going to knee-jerk change letters. You have a process, you have a compliance department, you have policies, you have procedures. There's several layers of review that those changes get before they go into production. You have outside counsel that looks at them for you. Although I agree with Robbie that changing letters, this might be as good a time as any to do that. That doesn't mean you should circumvent your own company's processes for controlling how you change letters, because as everybody on this call knows, one technical defect in a letter could cause you a lot of problems.
Yep.
Jen, I wanted to circle back and sort of ask you the question that Robbie mentioned about budget. Is that something that you're taking into account during your process for prioritizing?
Yes. So it's not just budget. What can we afford? It's also how you're going to afford it. And I've, in a variety of different situations, I don't own my company, and to be able to get the check writers to get on board and buy into all these changes, it's much easier to be able to show, well, I need one humongous check that's not going to fly very well, as opposed to, well, we're going to have quarterly goals for 2021. And this is what we're going to do in Q1, Q2, Q3, and final implementation leading up to the effective date of the final rule. And just being able to keep in mind, we're all in for-profit companies for the most part. And certainly we're all in organizations where maintaining a keen eye on budget is critical. And being able to do that in the most effective way possible is going to be key to successful implementation of all these changes. It's not just a matter of, hey, these are our legal requirements, let's get them done ASAP. And here's all the money I need to get that done. It's working within your organization and understanding where those constraints are, and practically speaking, what's going to be given up in order to fund all these different organizational structural changes. There's going to be some takeaway from other priorities, other projects, and that has to be justified, or else, if you can't justify it to ownership, to leadership, to your board of directors, that's something you need to be able to develop so you can get their buy-in.
Or, what you could do is be a not-for-profit company like Dennis is, and then none of this really matters at that point. That would work too.
You want to follow up on that, Dennis?
Just because you don't make a profit doesn't make you a not-for-profit. That's
all right. Technically, you are correct, Dennis. I'll give you, that's two rights in the same call.
Looking at, obviously, we've had more time to digest the provisions that were in part one versus what was in part two that came out on Friday. But to the degree that you've been able to sort of look at everything so far, what areas of the rule do you think are going to cause the most issues during this implementation phase? And how would you instruct an agency, or how would you work with your agency to deal with those issues? And John, we haven't given you the chance to go first yet.
Well, two things come to mind. First is the validation notice. And more importantly, these new rules now distinguish between validation notice and validation information. Before these rules came out, we would all use this industry jargon. We'd just say validation notice, and everybody knew what we meant. We meant the letter, and we meant the content of the letter. Now, the Bureau has really kind of separated these two things. We have the validation notice, which is the vehicle through which we deliver validation information. And the term validation information is very specifically defined, and it contains a lot of information that your validation notice is going to be required to contain. And I think a hurdle that a lot of collectors are going to have is obtaining all of the information that is required to be provided in the validation notice now moving forward after these rules are implemented, particularly with respect to the itemization date, which is also a very specifically defined term, and the kind of information we have to include in our validation notices now. That's the first one. The second one is getting creditor involvement in the collection process a little bit more, particularly with respect to agent collectors who want to utilize email communications to deliver their validation notice. It is possible to actually eliminate the entirety of a debt collector's postage cost, which can be millions upon millions of dollars. However, it requires creditor cooperation. And to me, that's going to be another hurdle for if agencies are really focused on eliminating their postage cost and going to a completely electronic communication workflow, then getting creditors on board is going to be another hurdle. I don't think it's insurmountable because the dollars make sense for that to happen, but those are the two things that come to mind when it comes to what are going to be the difficulties here.
John, do you suggest agencies have a provision within their contracts with creditors that say, that better outline what creditors will be agreeing to do to cooperate with agencies?
Well, the more clarity we have in collection agreements about the expectations of each party, I think the better. But the difficulty, I think, is, well, what the rub, I think, for many creditors is going to be the cooperation in the handoff process to the agency. Because if an agency wants to take advantage of the bona fide error defense for sending email communication to a consumer, one of the ways they can take advantage is by having the creditor send a communication to the consumer about the collector's imminent collection of the account from the consumer using that email address. And so in the absence of the creditor's participation in that process, it sort of stymies the collector from using electronic communication to deliver the validation notice and still get the protection under the rule. Nothing says you can't do that now. You just don't get the protection of the rule. And so if you want the protection of the bona fide error defense and you want to eliminate your postage cost by sending your validation notice electronically, the better part of valor is to try and get your creditor client involved in that process, because there is a detailed mechanism for handing off the account to the collector that would allow the collector to then use email and still benefit from a bona fide error defense.
I would think,
I was just going to say, Dennis, I think the problem, I think that's well and good, but a lot of my clients do collections for very large companies, and they don't get to say what's in their agreements a lot. And so if you have the right to make that request, I think that's good. But in order for that change to really happen, is that the creditors have to understand on their own that in order to help the industry and to increase their profits and their recovery rates, that they're going to have to make that change on their side. And I think that I think you can ask for it, but I mean, a lot of my clients, I know that they get agreements that there's no negotiation. They're told, this is what if you want to collect for us, this is what you have to do. And I'd be willing to bet that a big chunk of collection agencies are in that same boat. So the hope is, I think from our side, is that we would see the creditors recognizing this opportunity and helping the agencies out, and at the same time, helping their bottom line by doing that.
And Robbie, I'm hopeful that for many creditors who see that there are hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to be saved by implementing one small, relative small in quotes, process on the creditor side, that it will cause creditors to at least consider becoming a little bit more involved in the handoff process in order to allow their collector to take advantage of the protection and the reduced cost. But we're going to see price adjustments in the market now because of that, and I think there's an opportunity for a real sharing of the cost savings that the new rule gives the industry an opportunity to take advantage of.
And we could point out that eventually, after the TCPA was around for a while, creditors started putting language into their customer agreements that giving consent to collection agencies that did help. So since they saw that positive thing, this is the time I think where you start talking to your creditors or your clients and saying, hey, are you guys going to give us a hand on this? Are you going to do something? Because that's something that's a very polite telephone call that you can make that costs you no money, really, in order to see if you can encourage them to get involved. I think that's the one area. I think that the two things that I see that are going to be the hardest, one is dealing with the creditors, recognizing that they could help everybody out in this process. And the other side is dealing with the credit bureaus, the credit reporting bureaus, because of the new provision that says that you can't report until after you send out the notices. And it has been, at times, let's say, an interesting relationship between collection agencies and the bureaus. And I'm wondering how these things that are outside of the control of the collection agencies, how those may be impacted in an interesting way. Let's just put it that way. But I think the hardest part are going to be the things that the collection agencies themselves cannot control, which has been the story of their lives since the beginning of this, is their clients, and on the other hand, the vendors that they have to rely on. And those are going to be tough. Hopefully, though, the good thing about having such a long rollout is that we have 11 months for people to start having those conversations about what are we going to do? Will you guys work with us? That kind of stuff that would sort of lead in. I'm betting Judd probably has already started those calls.
Already started them, and the whole topic kind of stole my thunder. Is the wrong way, but I completely agree. My main the hurdle, the biggest challenge I saw was it's third parties, your creditor clients, and getting them in a position to assist you in the way necessary for you to comply, for agencies to comply with the final rule. My experience, Robbie, you mentioned this a second ago, is getting your creditor clients to obtain that prior express consent for TCPA purposes. That was a long battle, and with varying degrees of success with our clients. And we deal with primarily medical debt, and it's the person who is your contact at a hospital system or a physician practice group is usually not the person who controls patient intake. And the decision makers at any creditor are not on one issue where you need information are not always your contact as well. So you're having to deal with those organizations, the internal structure and the internal approval process. And that's lengthy. That's a long time coming. And I think it needs to be planned in advance. Yeah, as you mentioned, we have 11 months and I'm thinking to myself, we only have 11 months because it's going to take a long time to be able to have your larger institutional clients change their data output to provide you the information that you need in order to essentially have that substantiation on an account and be able to show the full automation and all the adjustments that have happened and all that. It's not just the case anymore where a client can place an account with a consumer's name, contact information, and current balance. We're going to have more robust systems, and the data give and take between agency and creditor client really needs to be ramped up and be made more robust and more complete. And that's going to be a lengthy process because the approvals, the cost, and sometimes custom programming and functional challenges within that as well. That's all going to take a lot of time.
Rob, you do make an excellent point about smaller versus bigger companies, and the bigger companies maybe being slower, bigger creditors being slower to make recommended changes or give as much assistance as maybe a smaller company. I mean, as a collection attorney, when I'm reviewing things and I see where a creditor is missing an opportunity, whether it be in a contractual language or an arbitration provision that should be tweaked in order to better file cases in the state of Missouri, where change it to a small claims exception, small claims court to small claims and associate circuit court as an example. Then I've had great feedback from clients and agencies being willing to make changes, and some of those are from the smaller, but even the bigger companies have been willing to do so. So let's I guess don't be too pessimistic or
Never pessimistic, Dennis.
No, I don't mean pessimistic. I just mean I think a lot of creditors will be willing to do this, especially the more educated they get and the more we put the focus on them doing things is in their best interest more than anything.
Well, I think Judd's exactly right, though. It's going to depend on who's the decision maker that's in control of the information that you're going to need. Because what I've seen some of the it's interesting with some of our clients who do collections on behalf of credit card companies. Some of those guys, even when it's in their best interest, you still got to push them into what's the right thing to do. And then and I don't really know why. Maybe it is because they have so many different divisions taking control. And you see other companies that are large step buyers, and those guys are already ahead of the ball game on this stuff. They're already collecting this information because a lot of them are doing collection lawsuits before, and then they're just having us come in and defend first party actions, but they're already doing collection lawsuits. They're going to have a lot of this stuff already. I think it's going to be I just don't think there's a simple answer for it. But what I would tell all of my clients right now is to start the conversation. If you don't explain to these people the potential benefits that would also benefit them, because at the end of the day, they need you. They needed you to come and collect this money that's out there that helps them in the long run. And as long as you show your worth to them, they have to at least listen. It may be slow as Christmas is getting there, but at least there's an opportunity, and you have a really good reason to start the conversation now, which is, look, the rules came out. We only have 11 months. Let's talk about what we can do that will help each other. But I just don't think there's a simple answer on it. I do think that some agencies are going to have a hard time getting their clients to budge on this at all, just because I'm thinking like in some of the telecom space, and those guys, they historically don't move as quickly as they could. And you would think that since they have so much money in the collections arena that they would move faster. They just don't. And I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense to me, because I would like to do a kumbaya conversation with them, saying we're all here to help each other and let's move along. But so far, no one's taking my call on that.
I think it just comes down to cost benefit. If the cost of cooperating with your debt collector exceeds the benefit, it's just they're not going to do it. And the bigger the company is, the more difficult it is to move the mountain. And sometimes the cost, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze sometimes. And when collections is such a very, very small part of a very big company's operation, I've seen that creditors, notwithstanding that they understand they could get some more money out of it if the cost outweighs the benefit, then they still won't do it, notwithstanding. I think that's one of the reasons I've seen, Robbie, but I agree with you to the extent, collectors and their own creditor clients can start having that conversation now, then collectors will very quickly learn which creditor clients are going to be willing to play ball and which aren't. And those creditor clients are going to get better rates. Everybody's going to make money. The margins are going to be a little bit better. And, I think over time, there might be actually some upward pressure in the marketplace in terms of small and mid-sized agencies and small and mid-sized creditors are actually probably going to be taking advantage of these rules a little bit more than the megaliths of the industry.
Yep, I think that's right.
We've got 2 minutes left. And what I thought we'd do is maybe just give each of you the chance to, are there any sort of burning questions inside the provisions of either part 1 or part 2 of the rule that you've yet to find answers for, or that you're still, that you think are going to be the most difficult to find answers for? What's going to keep you awake at night during the next 11 months?
One thing I think will be
Hi,
difficult.
Dennis.
I'm sorry. One thing I think will be important for people to remember, agencies who do collect in a lot of different states or nationwide, is all the state disclosures, and not only that, but how state regulations are going to maybe conflict at times with the new validation notice. For example, Washington has a whole bunch of stuff and it requires that the new validation notice might not. You need to make sure that it's all in there. Same with California and New York, states that are have a lot of specific requirements to not to remember that just because you're getting a sample, it'll probably a template from the CFPB, doesn't mean we can use that without ignoring state laws, state regulations.
I'll go. And the thing for me is that I think that a lot of my clients have been hopeful that when we got these CFPB rules and regulations out, that they would have some clear answers and some clear guidance in the short term of exactly when to start doing this, that they would have sample letters they could lock onto. And if they just did it this way, then everything would be copacetic in their world. So I'm trying to figure out how many different ways I can tell my clients that I wish that were the case, but as things are in the area of law, this is just the start of a conversation that is not going to be one that's simple or easy. And you're going to get sued even when you follow the rules to the T under the CFPB. And the example I give to most of my clients, it's a true story. I have a plaintiff's firm who made a recommendation to a court that the court adopted about, if you put this language in, you're good. It was a statute of limitations language. And then my client put that language in. That very same plaintiff's attorney sued my client, saying that the language they had recommended and adopted by the court was misleading. So, no matter what you do, someone is going to find a way of twisting that into something else. So I hope that everyone understands this is not a simple solution that's going to solve or make the playing field in the legal world for this stuff to be one where the rules we all know and that's it. It's just not going to be the case.
Yeah, that's the thing that I think about most often as well, Robbie, is, these rules provide a lot of bona fide error defenses, and that's all they are, is defenses to claims. And the burden is on the defendant to prove the bona fide error defense. And like Robbie said earlier, in many places around the country, judges aren't going to decide whether or not you get the benefit of that defense. Instead, they're going to let juries decide. And that's one of the most expensive defenses you can offer in an FDCPA case, is the bona fide error defense, and going all the way to trial and asking a box full of jurors to find that you've taken advantage of the bona fide error defense correctly. Although, there may be some cursory comfort in reading a rule that provides all these defenses, in reality, they're going to be very expensive to actually prove those defenses every time you get sued. And so, on the one side, I'm a bit disappointed that they don't just give us complete safe harbor, which I consider to be a little bit different than a bona fide error defense. But instead, they've given us these defenses that we have to now prove. And Robbie, I'm hoping that the next thing you were going to say about the case that you just described is that the client did not pay ransom money to settle that case, which was wrong, shouldn't have been brought, and frivolous, because every time a debt collector pays ransom money on a case that has no merit, all we do is encourage more of that bad behavior.
John, you know me. You know I'm not going to recommend them pay ransom. Come on. That's not what I do, ever. So, no, they did not pay them.
Mike, I haven't gone, but just in the last few seconds we have, my takeaway is it's more practical speaking, but as you start to put your plan of action in place from the agency side of it, these are complex, convoluted, wide-ranging aspects of the final rule. There are a lot of moving parts, and being organized on your approach is really critical. And I can see just from a psychological perspective, you can, a compliance officer or whoever's in charge at your organization can be paralyzed into inaction because there's so much and it's so confusing and so many parts seem to contradict each other. And how am I going to do all this? And just being able to get a foundational approach to it where you have that organization in place, you're tracking everything, nothing's going to slip through the cracks, and you can take it methodically, I think is going to be the key to success in implementing this and going forward.
Well, Judd, Dennis, John, Robbie, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. I really appreciate you taking your time to sit down and share such great perspective with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, everybody, thank you for watching today. Thanks for your questions. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring this webinar and the series of webinars aimed at analyzing and breaking down the CFPB's debt collection rule. Stay tuned. We've got webinars coming up tomorrow on the shifting regulatory landscape in the debt collection industry, and Wednesday on a whole webinar on debt parking. So you can sign up for those at accountsrecovery.net. Hope you do that. Until then, take care, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.